The northern plains lay buried beneath a blizzard's hush. White winds carved through the emptiness, bending skeletal trees and erasing the edges of the world. Wagon wheels creaked against frozen ground. Horses snorted steam into the biting air, their breath forming small clouds that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Buckthorn Road stretched ahead like a scar across the snow-bitten landscape, a lonely cut through territory that swallowed travelers whole if they weren't careful. Every breath scraped cold. The storm's silence pressed down like a weight, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of hooves and the occasional groan of wood against iron. This was the Wild West stripped bare, no romance, no glory, just survival measured in miles and the hope that home waited on the other side of the white. Jonah Mercer guided his wagon forward with the steady grip of a man who'd made this journey 100 times before. Frost clung to his beard, turning the dark hair silver at the edges. Weariness lived in his eyes, not the tiredness of a single day, but the deep exhaustion that came from years of loss, labor, and loneliness. His hands, calloused from rope burns and fence posts, from branding irons and wagon reins, held steady despite the cold gnawing at his fingers. He wore a heavy coat that had seen better seasons, patched at the elbows, worn thin at the shoulders. Beside him, his 6-year-old son Caleb huddled close, wrapped in a wool coat that had belonged to someone bigger. The boy's eyes were wide beneath his father's hat, too large for his small head but necessary against the wind. They were leaving town after picking up supplies, salt, flour, lamp oil, the essentials that would carry them through another brutal winter on the ranch. The ride home would take hours, and darkness was already creeping across the plains. Then Caleb tugged his sleeve. His small voice barely rose above the wind. "Papa, look at her eyes." Jonah pulled the reins. The horses slowed, grateful for the rest. And there, standing in the middle of Buckthorn Road like an apparition, was a woman who should not have been there. She stood barefoot in the snow. Her feet were already stained red where the cold had cracked her skin. She wore a cream-colored dress, lace at the collar, intricate stitching along the bodice, the kind of garment meant for ceremony, not survival. But the hem was frozen stiff, the fabric torn at the shoulder, and the lace hung wilted and soaked. Her dark hair clung wet to her pale cheeks, strands plastered against her skin like she'd been caught in the storm for hours. She didn't shiver. Didn't move. Just stood there with her arms loose at her sides, staring at the wagon as though she'd been expecting it. As though she'd been waiting for Jonah Mercer specifically. Jonah's chest tightened. Recognition hit him like a fist. Mira Hale. The name echoed in his mind, dragging memories with it. The woman he'd once intended to marry. The woman who'd sat beside him at church socials, who'd laughed at his clumsy jokes, who touched his hand in the barn when no one was looking and promised him a future. Until one day, 2 winters ago, she vanished. No warning. No explanation. Just gone. Folks in town had their theories. Some said she'd run off with a drifter passing through. Others claimed she'd married into money somewhere east. A few whispered darker things, that she'd died, that she'd been taken, that she'd simply chosen to forget Jonah Mercer existed. And now she stood in the snow like a runaway bride, bleeding and silent, waiting for him to decide what came next. Jonah climbed down from the wagon without speaking. His boots sank into the snow, each step deliberate, cautious, the way a man approaches something he doesn't trust. Mira didn't move. Didn't flinch. Just watched him with those dark eyes that once held warmth but now seemed hollow, emptied of something vital. Up close, he could see the tremor in her jaw, the way her lips had turned faintly blue. Her hands hung limp at her sides, fingers pale as bone. Caleb peered over the wagon's edge, his small face pinched with concern. "Is she a ghost, Papa?" "No," Jonah said quietly. "She's real." But he wasn't entirely certain. He stripped off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. The fabric swallowed her frame. She was thinner than he remembered, angles where softness used to be, shadows beneath her cheekbones that spoke of hunger or sleeplessness or both. When he touched her arm to guide her toward the wagon, her skin felt like ice through the wet fabric of her dress. "Can you walk?" he asked. Mira nodded, but her first step faltered. Her feet left small prints of blood in the snow. Jonah caught her before she fell, lifting her with an ease that surprised him. She weighed almost nothing. He set her in the back of the wagon among the supply crates and grain sacks, then climbed back to the driver's seat. Caleb twisted around to stare at her, fascination overriding fear. "Why don't you have shoes?" the boy asked. Myra's voice came out hoarse, barely louder than the wind. "I left in a hurry." Jonah snapped the reins. The horses lurched forward, eager to escape the cold. The wagon rolled onward through the storm, carrying 3 people bound by silence and questions that felt too heavy to voice. Snow continued to fall in thick curtains, erasing their tracks as quickly as they were made. The Mercer Ranch appeared through the white like a mirage, a low cabin with a sagging porch, a barn that leaned slightly westward, fences half buried in drifts. Smoke rose from the chimney, a promise of warmth. Jonah helped Mira down from the wagon and guided her inside while Caleb scrambled ahead to stoke the fire. The interior was simple: wooden table, iron stove, shelves lined with canned goods and worn books. A single lantern cast long shadows across the walls. Mira moved toward the stove like a moth to flame, hands extended toward the heat. Jonah fetched blankets from the bedroom, rough wool that smelled faintly of cedar and horses, and wrapped them around her shoulders. She sank onto a chair, head bowed, dark hair falling forward to hide her face. Caleb watched from the corner, quiet now, sensing the weight of adult troubles he couldn't yet name. Silence filled the cabin. Outside, snow crackled against the roof in a slow, steady rhythm. The fire popped and hissed. Minutes stretched. Jonah stood near the door, arms crossed, jaw working as he fought to contain the storm building inside him. Finally, the words came out rough, scraped raw by 2 years of wondering. "You disappeared. Left me like a fool standing at your door with flowers and plans. Folks said you ran off with a drifter. Others said you married rich and didn't have the decency to say goodbye." Myra's shoulders tensed beneath the blankets. She drew a tremulous breath, but didn't look up. "Both stories were wrong," she whispered. "Then tell me the right one." She lifted her head slowly, eyes reflecting firelight. Her expression held something between shame and defiance, grief and relief, the complicated geography of a truth too long buried. "I was promised to a banker's son in Copper Ridge." The words landed like stones in still water, ripples spreading outward. Jonah went still. The name Copper Ridge carried weight. It was a 3 days' ride east, a town built on silver veins and merchant wealth, where bankers wore tailored suits and their wives dripped in jewelry shipped from San Francisco. It was everything his ranch was not. Mira continued, her voice barely steady. "My family arranged it. They said marrying you would trap me in poverty. They said you weren't." She swallowed hard. "They said you weren't enough." Caleb shifted in the corner, small eyes darting between his father and the woman wrapped in blankets. The boy understood little about marriage and class, but he understood when he heard it. Jonah's jaw tightened. "And you agreed?" "No." The word came out sharp, almost angry. Mira looked up at him fully now, and for the first time since appearing on that snow-buried road, there was fire in her eyes. "I didn't agree to anything. But my father didn't ask for my permission. He made the arrangement with Jacob Drummond, the banker, over whiskey and cigars. They shook hands on it like I was livestock being traded." She pulled the blanket tighter, knuckles white. "When I told them I had already promised to you that we'd made plans, my father laughed. Said I was playing romance with a dirt farmer and it was time to grow up. My mother cried but didn't defend me. She said I'd thank them someday when I had a proper house and a proper name." Jonah felt something cold settle in his chest, Not anger exactly, but something deeper. Class. Wealth. The invisible chains that bound people more effectively than iron ever could. He'd known men who judged worth by land deeds and bank accounts, who measured a person's value in dollars rather than character. He'd never imagined Myra's family would be among them. They sent me away before I could tell you, Myra said quietly. Packed my things in the middle of the night and took me to Copper Ridge under the guise of preparing for the wedding. They called it training for refinement. Etiquette lessons. Posture coaching. How to hold a teacup, how to greet guests at parties, how to smile without showing too much feeling. Her voice cracked. They locked me in their guest house. Said it was for my own protection, to keep me from making foolish decisions. Jonah exhaled slowly. A cage with lace curtains and fine china. A prison that smelled of perfume instead of rust. For 2 years, he asked. Jacob Drummond traveled frequently for business. The wedding kept being postponed, first for his father's illness, then for a business deal in Denver, then because the weather wasn't suitable. Bitterness edged her words. I think he didn't actually want a wife. Just the appearance of one when it suited him. Meanwhile, I lived in that guest house like a doll in a box, taken out and displayed when necessary, then put back on the shelf. Caleb crept closer, drawn by the pain in her voice. He climbed onto the chair beside her, small hand reaching toward hers. Myra glanced down at him, and something in her expression softened. And the wedding dress? Jonah said, nodding toward the ruined garment beneath the blankets. Myra's eyes filled with something between rage and relief. Tonight was the wedding. They finally set a date. Jacob returned from his latest trip, and my father insisted it happen immediately, before I could cause problems, he said. They dressed me, painted my face, and put flowers in my hair. She paused, breathing hard. And when they left me alone to prepare for the ceremony, I climbed through the window. Tore the dress on the frame. Ran barefoot into the snow because staying one more minute felt like dying. Jonah stared at her, trying to reconcile the woman before him with the girl he'd known 2 years ago. That Myra had been softer somehow, less hardened by the world's cruelties. This woman bore scars that didn't show on her skin, the kind carved by betrayal and captivity dressed up as care. You ran, he said slowly. In a snowstorm. Without shoes. Without knowing where you'd end up. I knew exactly where I'd end up, Myra corrected. Anywhere but there. Death in the snow seemed preferable to a lifetime married to a man who saw me as an acquisition. She met his eyes. I walked for hours. Followed the road west because I remembered it led back toward the plains. Toward home. Toward. She stopped herself, but the unspoken word hung between them. Toward you. Caleb's small fingers curled around hers. The boy's touch seemed to anchor her, pulling her back from whatever dark place the memories had dragged her toward. She squeezed his hand gently. But Jonah wasn't finished. The question that had haunted him for 2 years demanded answers, and now that she sat before him, real, breathing, bleeding, he couldn't let it go unanswered. Then why didn't you send a letter? His voice came out rougher than intended. One note could have changed everything. I would have come for you. Burned that guest house to the ground if I had to. But you left me with silence, Myra. 2 years of nothing. At that, Myra's eyes filled with tears that finally spilled over. Her face crumpled, and when she spoke, her voice broke into pieces. I did, she whispered. I wrote to you. 3 times. Jonah froze. The first letter I wrote 2 weeks after they took me. I explained everything, where I was, what they'd done, how much I needed you to know I didn't choose this. Tears tracked down her cheeks, catching firelight. The second letter came a month later when I realized you hadn't responded. I thought maybe the first had been lost. I wrote again, begging you to write back, even if it was just to say you'd moved on. Her hands trembled beneath Caleb's. The third letter I wrote after 6 months. By then I was desperate. I told you where the guest house was, what time the guards changed shifts, how you could reach me if you wanted. I gave every detail I could think of. Jonah's heart pounded. I never received any letters. I know that now, Mira said, voice thick. But I didn't know it then. I thought, she broke off, choking on the words. I thought you'd chosen silence. I thought maybe my family was right about you, that you'd decided I wasn't worth the trouble. Or worse, that you were glad I was gone. Who delivered them? Jonah demanded, though something cold and terrible was already forming in his mind. Mira wiped at her tears with shaking fingers. Your foreman came to Copper Ridge on business. I saw him from the window, recognized him immediately. I managed to get the letters to him through a maid who felt sorry for me. Walt Hennessy. He promised he'd deliver them personally. Swore on his honor he'd put them directly in your hands. Walt Hennessy. The name landed like a gunshot in the quiet cabin. Jonah's foreman. A man who'd worked the ranch for 5 years. A man whose admiration for Mira had always carried an edge of something darker, possessiveness disguised as concern, jealousy wrapped in loyalty. Walt, who'd been there the night Mira vanished, offered hollow condolences and said maybe it was for the best, that a woman like her would have grown bored with ranch life eventually. Walt, who'd watched Jonah grieve and said nothing. The truth twisted, reshaped. A betrayal neither of them had seen coming. Jonah sat down heavily, the weight of realization pressing through him like a physical force. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. Walt Hennessy. A man he'd trusted with his cattle, his land, his livelihood. A man who'd stood beside him through harsh winters and difficult calving seasons. A man who'd smiled and offered whiskey when Jonah couldn't sleep, who'd listened to him talk about Myra's disappearance and nodded sympathetically while knowing exactly where she was and why she'd never written back. He destroyed them, Jonah said quietly. Not a question. A statement of fact that tasted like ash. Mira nodded, fresh tears sliding down her face. I didn't understand why you never came. Why did you never respond? The maid told me Walt had taken the letters and promised to deliver them within days. But weeks passed. Months. Nothing. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. I started to believe what my family had said about you. That you weren't strong enough to fight for me. That you'd given up too easily. Maybe I'd imagined the love between us. Jonah closed his eyes. All this time, he'd built his own truth because it hurt less than uncertainty. He'd told himself that Mira had chosen wealth over him, that she'd looked at his rough hands and simple cabin and decided she deserved better. He'd carried that story like armor, letting it harden him against the pain of her absence. And all the while, she'd been locked away, thinking he'd abandoned her. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. Walt hadn't just stolen letters, he'd stolen 2 years from both of them. 2 years of grief and misunderstanding. 2 years of Mira imprisoned and Jonah alone. 2 years that could never be recovered. Why? Mira asked, her voice small and broken. Why would he do that? Jonah remembered the way Walt used to watch Mira when she visited the ranch. How his eyes would follow her across the yard. How he'd find excuses to talk to her, to offer help she didn't need. How his jaw would tighten whenever Jonah's arm went around her shoulders. Jonah had dismissed it as harmless admiration, the kind of longing any man might feel toward a beautiful woman who belonged to someone else. But it hadn't been harmless. It had been poisoned, festering quietly. He wanted you, Jonah said flatly. Or he wanted me to suffer. Maybe both. Caleb shifted closer to Mira, his young face troubled by emotions he couldn't fully comprehend. The boy had never known his mother, she died bringing him into the world. Mira was the first woman he'd seen his father look at with anything resembling tenderness. And now that tenderness was tangled with anger and grief and years of wasted time. Myra's shoulders shook with silent sobs. I thought you didn't want me anymore. I thought I'd been wrong about everything we had. Do you know what that does to a person? To believe the one thing you held on to was a lie. Jonah reached across the table, his rough hand covering hers. The touch was tentative, uncertain. 2 years had created a chasm between them that couldn't be crossed with a single gesture. But it was a start. I thought the same, he admitted. I thought you'd looked at this life and found it lacking. I thought you'd chosen silk and silver over calloused hands and hard winters. His voice roughened. I built a wall around that hurt, Mira. Told myself I was better off alone. Told myself you were never real to begin with, just a dream I'd been foolish enough to believe in. She turned her hand palm up beneath his, their fingers intertwining slowly. We were both wrong. We were both lied to, Jonah corrected. There's a difference. Outside, the wind howled against the cabin walls. The fire crackled. And in the warm glow of lamplight, 2 people who'd been separated by deception sat holding hands across a table, trying to navigate the wreckage of what should have been. Silence settled over them again, but this time it felt different, less oppressive, more contemplative. The kind of quiet that allowed wounds to breathe before they could begin to heal. Mira stared at their joined hands, her thumb tracing small circles against Jonah's calloused palm. Caleb had grown drowsy in the warmth, his head resting against Myra's shoulder, small body relaxed in the way only children could manage when they sensed safety. Jonah studied her face, really looked at her for the first time since lifting her into the wagon. The years showed themselves in subtle ways. Fine lines at the corners of her eyes that hadn't been there before. A hardness in her jaw that spoke of clenched teeth and swallowed protests. The curve of her cheekbone is more pronounced, hollowed by stress and inadequate meals. She'd been beautiful 2 years ago. She was still beautiful now, but it was a different kind of beauty, one forged in survival rather than given freely. What will you do now? He asked quietly. Myra's eyes lifted to meet his. I don't know. I can't go back to Copper Ridge. My father will hunt for me, he owes Jacob Drummond too much money to let me simply vanish. The wedding was meant to settle debts as much as secure status. Bitterness laced her words. I was collateral. A bargaining chip with a heartbeat. They'll come looking, Jonah agreed. It wasn't a question. Eventually. But the storm will slow them. They won't expect me to have gotten far on foot. She glanced toward the window where snow continued to fall in thick sheets, obscuring the world beyond. And they won't think to look for me here. My family knew we were courting once, but they believed I'd forgotten you. That their training had reshaped me into someone who wouldn't lower herself to a rancher's life. Jonah felt a flicker of something dark, not quite anger, but close. You're welcome to stay as long as you need. They won't find you here unless you want to be found. Myra's grip on his hand tightened. I don't want to bring trouble to your door, Jonah. If they discover I'm here, they'll make things difficult for you. My father has connections, lawyers, lawmen who owe him favors. He could claim I was kidnapped. Could accuse you of. Let them come, Jonah interrupted, his voice steady and low. I've dealt with worse than entitled men who think people can be owned. This land doesn't bow to their kind of power. Something flickered in Myra's eyes, gratitude mixed with disbelief, as though kindness had become foreign to her. You'd risk that? After everything? After I disappeared and left you with questions and hurt? You didn't disappear, Jonah said firmly. You were taken. There's a difference. He paused, jaw working. And the hurt wasn't your fault. It was Walt's. It was your family's. But it wasn't yours. Tears welled in her eyes again, but she blinked them back. Caleb stirred against her shoulder, mumbling something incoherent in his half-sleep. Mira adjusted the blanket around him, maternal instinct surfacing naturally despite never having been a mother. "He's a good boy," she whispered. "He is," Jonah agreed. "His mother died bringing him into the world. It's been just the two of us since." He hesitated, then added, "He needs gentleness sometimes. The kind I'm not always good at providing." Mira looked at the sleeping child, then back at Jonah. "You've done well with him. I can see it in how safe he feels." "He's asked about you," Jonah admitted. "Not by name, he was too young to remember you clearly. But he's asked why there's no woman in the house. Why do other children have mothers and he doesn't?" The confession came reluctantly, as though admitting vulnerability required physical effort. "I never knew what to tell him." Myra's expression softened, pain and tenderness intertwining. She looked down at Caleb, his small face peaceful in sleep, then back at Jonah with something raw and honest in her eyes. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said quietly. "I know 2 years is a long time. I know you've built a life without me, and I have no right to walk back into it just because I finally escaped. I only needed a place to breathe until morning. Somewhere warm. Somewhere safe. Then I'll figure out where to go next." Jonah shook his head slowly, deliberately. "You're not going anywhere in this storm. And when it clears," he paused, choosing his words with the care of a man who'd learned that words could be weapons or bridges, depending on how they were wielded. "When it clears, you'll stay until you're healed. Until your feet aren't bleeding. Until you've had enough rest and food to think clearly about what comes next." "Jonah. This land has room for honesty," he interrupted gently. "That's all I ever wanted from you, Mira. Not perfection. Not some refined version of yourself that your family tried to create. Just honesty. Just the truth. And now that I know the truth, now that I understand what happened, I'm not turning you out into the cold." Myra's chin trembled. "And what do you want now?" The question came out barely above a whisper, fragile and uncertain. "After everything that's been lost. After all the time that's passed." Jonah sat back slightly, releasing her hand but not retreating entirely. He looked at her, really looked, seeing not the girl he'd once known but the woman she'd become through suffering and survival. He saw strength he hadn't recognized before. Resilience that only hardship could forge. And beneath the scars and the weariness, he saw the same person he'd fallen for years ago, unchanged in the ways that mattered. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, no romance, no flourish, no grand declarations. Just truth carved from years of ache and loneliness and learning to be honest about what he needed. "Stay till the thaw," he said. "Heal. Rest. Let yourself remember what it feels like to make your own choices without someone forcing your hand." He paused, then added softly, "And tell me the things your letters tried to say. The things Walt stole from us. I want to hear them now, if you're willing." Mira stared at him, tears spilling freely now. Her whole body trembled, not from cold, but from the overwhelming weight of being offered grace when she'd expected judgment. Of finding shelter when she prepared herself for more rejection. "I can do that," she whispered, voice breaking. "I can stay. I can tell you everything I wanted to say." Caleb shifted in his sleep, small hand reaching out instinctively. Mira caught it, holding his tiny fingers in hers. The gesture was natural, unforced, a preview of what could be if time and healing allowed it. Jonah stood slowly, retrieving another blanket from the bedroom. He draped it over Mira and Caleb both, creating a warm cocoon around them. "There's a bed in the back room. It's not much, but it's clean and warm. You should rest." Mira nodded but didn't move immediately. Instead, she looked up at him with eyes full of questions she didn't yet know how to ask. Questions about forgiveness and the future. About whether love could be rebuilt from ruins. About whether 2 years of separation and lies could be overcome by simple honesty and time. Jonah seemed to understand without her speaking. "We don't have to figure everything out tonight," he said gently. "Tonight, you're safe. Tomorrow, we'll talk. That's enough for now." "That's more than enough," Mira said, her voice thick with gratitude. "It's more than I hoped for." Outside, the storm continued its assault on the plains, but inside the cabin, warmth held firm. And for the first time in 2 years, neither of them felt quite so alone. By dawn, the storm had softened to a whisper. Snow still fell, but gently now, lazy flakes drifting down like afterthoughts, the blizzard's fury spent. The world outside lay transformed, buried beneath white drifts that smoothed rough edges and erased old boundaries. Fences disappeared. The road became indistinguishable from the fields. Everything looked new, remade, given another chance beneath the clean slate of fresh snow. Mira sat on the porch wrapped in Jonah's old coat, the same one he'd draped over her shoulders on that frozen road. It swallowed her frame, sleeves hanging past her fingertips, but it was warm and smelled faintly of leather and wood smoke and the man who'd worn it for years. Her feet, bandaged now with clean cloth torn from spare linen, rested on a stool Jonah had brought out for her. The bleeding had stopped. The pain remained, but it was manageable, the kind of hurt that would heal with time and care. She watched the horizon slowly warm from gray to gold as the sun struggled through the clouds. Light spread across the snow in gradual increments, turning the white landscape amber, then pink, then finally the pale gold of winter morning. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way, the kind of beauty that demanded respect rather than sentiment. Jonah emerged from the barn, breath steaming in the cold air. He'd been tending the horses, checking on the livestock that had weathered the storm in their shelters. Snow clung to his hat and shoulders. He paused when he saw her sitting there, as if surprised to find her real and still present, not a dream that had evaporated with the night. He climbed the porch steps slowly, boots heavy with accumulated snow. He didn't sit immediately, just stood there looking out at the same horizon she'd been watching. A cautious distance remained between them, 3 feet of cold air and 2 years of hurt that couldn't be crossed all at once. But it was a distance he was willing to cross slowly. Deliberately. With intention rather than recklessness. "Caleb's still asleep," Jonah said quietly. "Good," Mira replied. "He needs rest. Children shouldn't have to carry adult troubles." "No," Jonah agreed. "They shouldn't." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. They'd spent enough time in painful silence to recognize this as something different, the quiet of 2 people learning to exist in the same space again, relearning each other's rhythms and patterns. Mira pulled the coat tighter. "I'm not your bride," she said softly. Not with sadness, just acknowledgement. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. I don't know what I am anymore or who I'm supposed to be." "You're Mira," Jonah said simply. "That's enough." She looked up at him, searching his face for deception or pity or the kind of false comfort people offered when they didn't know what else to say. But she found only honesty, the same honesty he promised her the night before. "It won't be easy to love again," she warned. "I'm different now. Harder. More suspicious. I flinch at kindness because I've learned it often comes with conditions." "Then we'll take it slow," Jonah replied. "No conditions. No expectations beyond honesty and time." Mira nodded, tears threatening again but held back this time. She wasn't his bride. She wasn't officially anything. But she was no longer barefoot and bleeding in the snow. No longer alone. No longer trapped by wealthier hands and broken promises. She had warmth, shelter, and the space to heal at her own pace. Jonah finally sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Not quite contact, but proximity, an acknowledgement that the distance was narrowing, inch by careful inch. Together they watched Caleb appear in the doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. The boy spotted them and grinned, then bounded into the snow to make tracks and patterns only a child could see meaning in. Forgiveness wouldn't come easy. Trust would have to be rebuilt from foundation stones. The future remained uncertain, fragile as new ice on a winter pond. But for the first time in 2 years, the truth belonged to them and them alone, not to Walt Hennessy's lies, not to her family's manipulations, not to the stories others had told about them. And as morning light spread across the snow-covered plains, as Caleb's laughter cut through the cold air, Jonah reached over slowly and took Myra's hand. She didn't pull away. The thaw had already begun. Sometimes the truth gets buried deeper than winter snow. If this story of betrayal and second chances moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold tales from the Wild West. Drop a comment below. Do you think Jonah and Myra can truly rebuild what was stolen from them? Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.